Our entire economic system has been predicated on more and more oil that is roughly the same affordability every year. That is about to change right now. Our culture is energy blind. We think that technology and money are what really powers society. Technology is effectively machines powered by energy. It's really a measure of this fossil pixie dust that we're powering all of our machinery around the world. Once that starts to decline in a permanent way, it changes everything. Pushing world oil production higher is ending, and I think fourth quarter of 2018 will be the peak in world oil production, and if it's not, it'll be the first half of 2024, and I'm pretty confident about that. We are not going to prepare as a society for what's coming. We are not going to stop using carbon to slow climate change. We're going to hit a wall, and then we're going to have to respond. Humans have had more energy in our global society every single year the last 150 years. We feel that that's a natural law, that that's going to continue to increase, and it's not.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. It's an honor today to have Nate Hagens, who's the Director for the Institute of the Study of Energy and Our Future. This is an organization that's focused on educating and preparing society for the coming cultural transitions related to our energy usage patterns. Nate holds a master's degree in finance with honors from the University of Chicago and a PhD in natural resources from the University of Vermont. He has an excellent podcast called The Great Simplification, which hosts a variety of guests and topics related to energy and humankind's journey through what he terms the carbon pulse. And I've been wanting to get Nate on the channel for a long time because you really do have a plethora of unique guests on your channel and unique insights. And the first time I came across your flagship video, The Carbon Pulse, I was like, I got to get this guy on the podcast because it's a video that anybody can watch who, even if you don't have a background in understanding energy, you don't have to have a PhD to understand it, and it's a very well put together, and I strongly encourage people to go and check out that video afterwards if you want the condensed version of what we're going to talk about today. Asides that, I also wanted to have you on because as preppers, as you probably can appreciate, we are concerned about the precarious future that awaits, and energy factors into that, obviously, but it's up for debate the extent of how much it actually factors in. So maybe you can give us a breakdown of what you're talking about when you're referring to the carbon pulse.
The carbon pulse describes that humans, the main input to our modern economies is carbon or hydrocarbons, coal, oil, and natural gas. And we are pulling them out from under the ground in such vast quantities. They are so unbelievably powerful for what they provide for us. A barrel of oil from the tar sands or from the Permian Shale or from Russia or from Saudi Arabia roughly has 5.7 million British thermal units worth of energy potential in it. If you translate that to human labor potential, you and I shoveling dirt or putting up a barn or carrying things, we do around 0.6 kilowatt hours per day. So a barrel of oil does around 4 or 5 years worth of our physical work. Wow. And humans are using around 100 billion barrel of oil equivalents of the main fossil hydrocarbons per year, which means that we are adding 400 to 500 billion human worker equivalents to our economy every year, on top of the 5 billion real human workers. And the carbon pulse refers to that this is not an indefinite thing. These fuels are ancient sunlight, which were buried, compressed, refined by Mother Nature over millions to tens of millions, in the case of coal, hundreds of millions of years. And we are extracting them millions of times faster than they were trickle charged by daily photosynthesis of the past. And our cultural stories are that we are thinking this is interest, that it's just repeatable, but in reality, it's a bank account of energy dense magic that we are drawing down rapidly on human timescales.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So a lot of people, of course, there's a debate with respect to oil scarcity, but and perhaps you can correct me on this if I'm wrong. I was putting together some numbers today. These are very, ballpark estimates. So there's been 1 trillion barrels of oil that have been used throughout human history. And by current estimates, there's 1.6 trillion barrels left. They say this equates to 47 years of usage. However, on average, the industry often aims to recover around 30 to 40% of the original, what they call oil in place, and conventional oil reservoirs using standard recovery techniques. And for shale oil, it's even less at 5 to 20%. So this would actually mean that the recoverable amounts of oil are around 680 billion barrels, which might take us 20 years to burn. Now, that's assuming we don't find any more oil. But what are your thoughts around oil scarcity? Like, when are the lights just going to go out, or when are things going to become prohibitively expensive as a result of this energy crunch?
So let me unpack that. Yes, it's true that there are molecules of hydrocarbons under the ground, and there is primary oil recovery, which gets around 10% of the molecules out of the ground so that where humans can use them. That's like when you drill a hole, the pressure of the well shoots it out of the ground. That stuff is mostly gone. Then there's secondary oil recovery, which is things like shale, et cetera. And then there's tertiary oil recovery, which requires injecting chemicals and different exotic techniques, and that might be able to get a little bit more out. The issue is there's 2 separate questions. One is how much oil will ultimately be recovered and used by humans. The second question is, when does oil peak and decline? Those are related but very distinct questions, because our entire economic system has been predicated on more and more oil that is roughly the same affordability every year. And that is about to change right now. So there's such a thing called peak oil, which is an absolute scientific certainty that at some point, we don't know when, though I can take a good guess, the amount of oil that humans extract and burn will peak and then enter inevitable decline. That doesn't have to be a disaster. Right now, a lot of the things that we call oil in the global statistics that say we're extracting 100 million barrels a day are not really oil. They're natural gas plant liquids that get lumped into oil, and we make plastic baggies and other things. They're ethanol and biofuels, and all that gets lumped in. So, so far, the peak in global oil production was November of 2018. The United States, our shale plays account for the vast majority of oil production growth in the last 13 years. And we just, in the last few months, hit an all-time high in U.S. production, right over 13 million barrels a day. However, what's happening is all of our shale plays, and by the way, what is shale oil? Shale oil is the bottom of the barrel, metaphorically. It's in the source rock where all the original oil migrated from. So after shale oil, there's really nothing left other than oil shale, which is also called kerogen, which is basically uncooked rock that didn't have enough time and pressure to turn into oil. It's got about the energy density of a baked potato and requires a lot of energy and money to turn into oil. So I think that's one of those receding horizons that will always be the energy of the future, but will never really happen. But shale oil, all of the basins in the United States have peaked and are in permanent decline, except for the Permian. And the Permian is the granddaddy of all of them. But, and I have a podcast next week with Art Berman on this, What's happened with the Permian is we've high graded it, which means we've drilled the best, easiest, cheapest areas first, and we're cannibalizing it, meaning that if Company A and Company B have wells that are next to each other, the straw under the earth is kind of slurping the other company's oil. And so the total amount of well productivity is now in sharp decline versus 2020. So my thesis is that the United States pushing world oil production higher is ending. And I think it's reasonably likely that fourth quarter of 2018 will be the peak in world oil production. And if it's not, it'll be the first half of 2024. And I'm pretty confident about that. So that's a big deal because I think we have global expectations and arrangements around economic growth and money and other things. It doesn't seem like a big deal because our culture is energy blind. We think that technology and money are what really powers society. But in the complicated economic theories, which they taught me incorrectly in graduate school, basically technology is effectively machines powered by energy. It's really a measure of this fossil pixie dust that we're powering all of our machinery around the world. So once that starts to decline in a permanent way, it changes everything. Having said that, we're already down several million barrels from 2018 in a global level, and stock markets are all-time highs nearly. We've got new technology like AI and maybe quantum computing, and that productivity gain can offset the decline in oil for a little bit, but it's not going to change the larger situation that we have used technology and debt and shale oil to function as a larger straw. So the same amount of oil roughly is there, and we're just pulling it out faster because we have a wider straw, and we're that much closer to the slurping sound that you hear at the bottom of a milkshake. And if the milkshake glass is opaque, you don't get much warning on how close you are to the bottom until you hear the slurping sound. And I think we're going to start hearing that in the next 5 years, and it's going to be a big deal.
So why is the price of oil so low right now? How is it that it's so suppressed? Is it just economic reasons? Because the reality hasn't hit us yet? Or is it because we haven't hit that slurping sound?
I mean, the slurping sound would be, we've hit the slurping sound in the North Sea in the United Kingdom. I mean, their oil peaked 20 some years ago. So it's the global amount of oil that's relevant. And of course, OPEC controls a lot of oil. If you look at the new expanded BRICS nations, they control not 50% of the world's oil, but 50% of the world's exportable oil. I mean, first of all, Nate, this is horribly complex. When we talk about peak oil and how much oil production there will be in the future, the geology of it combined with the technology of it is the best case. This is the best case we could get. Then there's what's called above ground factors, which are the geopolitics, the ability of humans, consumers to afford it, and interest rates, and what the central banks are doing, and stimulus checks, and all that other stuff. I mean, it's not really low, right? It's 70 some dollars a barrel, and the long-term historic average was 20. It's just not hundreds of dollars a barrel. And the real worth of, I mean, that's the main flaw of our economic system is we've conflated the cost of oil and energy with the value it provides to society. And they're very different things. But the reason that it's low is consumers are tapped out. 41% of American households are what's called ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, but employed. The sugar high from the 2020 stimulus checks in response to COVID is becoming a hangover, and a lot of people don't have discretionary income. And this is, a global phenomenon. So it's possible. Well, I'll show this. In 2020, for a few hours, oil was negative $30 a barrel. And that's because the financial system can create trillions of dollars of more claims on reality than the actual reality. And if everyone has to get out at the same time, negative $30 a barrel makes no sense in a long-term basis.
Yeah.
But at the moment, there were more sellers than buyers. So that was the market clearing price. I mean, the fact that oil will peak and decline doesn't necessarily mean that oil prices are going to go to the moon in a straight line, because every time there will be a recession, we could go down to $30 or $20 or $10 a barrel of oil. And then every time we have a recovery, the next high is going to be a higher high, 150, 200, 300. But it's complex.
Yeah, you often talk about how oil is kind of a gift from the sun gods, if you will. You don't use that term, but I just use that term. But it's a gift because it's such a perfect fuel. And maybe you can talk a little bit about why it was the perfect fuel and why we're wasting it. And to talk about, and I say wasting it, conspicuous consumption, all those things. Some of it, of course, is necessary to power our civilization. But also about how you talk about the true value of it. And maybe just expound a bit more on, the fact that 1 barrel of oil contains so much human labor, and we're just exhausting it on frivolous pursuits and activities.
So one of the core themes of my work is that our culture is energy blind. We don't recognize how our lifestyles are supported by this vast amount of indistinguishable from magic on human timescales energy source. But another aspect of energy blindness is that not all energy is the same. And there's something called energy properties. There's energy density, which is how much energy in a unit of volume. There's power density, which is how much we get from a unit of land. There's spatial distribution, there's intermittence, there's energy return on investment. There's all kinds of properties that distinguish one energy type from another. A big one is there's potential versus kinetic energy. Potential energy is sitting there in a barrel or in the ground or in a reservoir, and you flick a switch and you can have your brain services from electricity or movement or heat or cooling or whatever you want. And the other type is kinetic energy, which is the electrons in motion that you have to harness them right when they're moving. For instance, when the sun shines or the wind blows with solar and wind technology. So oil in particular is especially valuable and uniquely suited to this global interconnected overnight 6-continent supply chain system that we've designed, because it's liquid at room temperature. It's incredibly energy dense. It can be transported in pipelines or on ships. It can be stored and it doesn't dissipate or degrade. And the amount of products that are useful for human societies, number in the thousands. It's not just gasoline that we get from oil. Gasoline is around 40% in the United States of what comes out of a barrel of oil. There's also diesel and naphtha and jet fuel and bunker fuel and plastic precursors and asphalt to make roads and all kinds of the chemical precursors that result in medicines and football helmets and for a Canadian audience, fishing poles and tents and many of the things on your war wall.
Hey, I won't take offense to that. There's truth to it.
I'm in Wisconsin. We have the same things.
Yeah. So while you're kind of scaring me, man, because, and I know that's not your intent, because it's
scaring you.
Believe it or not, I always play the devil's advocate with what I talk about on the channel. But if what you're saying is true, and based on my own, math that I've done, we don't have long before this starts to have real cultural effects and real consequences in terms of just socioeconomics, conflict, as we're seeing right now around the world. It's of no surprise to me that we're seeing conflicts emerge with the biggest oil producing nations, be they Iran, Russia, now Venezuela. potentially. Maybe we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But to stay on the topic of oil and its properties and things of that nature, what do you think about the U.S. Strategic Oil Reserve and its depletion? Is there something else going on there? And this is where we might be speculating a bit, which I have no problem with. You probably have more problem than I do because you're more of a scientist than I am. But what are your thoughts on it being down nearly 40% since last year?
I honestly don't think it's a big deal. I think it's a red herring. It's not that many millions of barrels, and it's a drop in the bucket relative to U.S. exporting oil and other aspects. I think it's a political red herring that people can complain about it. Having said that, it was designed for a rainy day when there might be some international incident and we need oil. And so it shouldn't be used just to reduce the pressure on consumers a little bit when things are already going pretty well. So I think it's a dumb idea to drain it, but the media kind of blew it out of proportion. I don't think it's that big of a deal given the scale of these other things we're talking about. And by the way, Nate, I forgot to say, because I think this is relevant, we've been running out of oil since we first drilled a well in the United States in 1859 in Pennsylvania, and there are other minor evidences of that around the world. We're not really running out per se, but what is happening is we're running out of the size and scale and price available to continue economic growth globally at a cost that people can afford. Because what we've done in the Industrial Revolution is we've created machines to replace tasks that humans used to do manually or with horses and oxen. And these machines require thousands to tens of thousands of units of energy to replace 1 unit of human or horse energy. The benefit of that is this energy we're adding to these machines is pennies relative to the human labor. So that has resulted in higher wages, higher profits, lower price stuff, more humans, more output and goods and services per human. But what ends up happening is that whole dynamic is really sensitive to the cost of energy. And what happened last year with Russia and Ukraine, prices of natural gas, at least for a while, really spiked in Europe and Germany. And it was the first phase of deindustrialization, because a lot of these plants, like a chemical plant or an aluminum smelter or anything that in this thousands to tens of thousands of units of external energy added to machines, all of a sudden had to pay double, triple, quadruple for their main input and became not only less profitable, but operated at a loss. And you saw thousands of these companies going out of business. Then there was a mild winter. And that kind of alleviated, and they signed LNG contracts with the United States and Qatar and other places. But I don't think that's a long-term solution. But getting back to the point I wanted to make, there's a lot of oil under the United States and other countries around the world. The issue is of flow rate and like how much can we get out at one time, and of cost. A shale oil well drilled today will decline at 80 to 90% of its total oil in the next 18 months. If the United States stopped drilling for oil for any reason, for financial reason, for political reason, for an environmental reason, for people that want to keep it in the ground because they're worried about the climate impacts of more oil, our oil production would decline 40% in the first year once we stop drilling, and another 20% in the second and third year. We are running faster and faster, drilling the pincushion of the United States in order to stay stable or boost our production a little bit. But the aggregate decline rate is accelerating quite rapidly. So this is going to be, I don't know that this is going to be a big deal in the next 2 or 3 years, but in the next 2 or 3 decades, this is going to completely reorient society.
And can you talk a little bit about the amount of energy invested to acquire 1 barrel of oil, what it is today versus what it previously was?
The data on that has become so fraught with ideology that I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that. But I did write my PhD on this concept, which maybe some of your viewers are unaware of. Humans are animals, and animals have optimal foraging dynamics. We like to invest a little and get more in return. A cheetah that chases a gazelle will expend energy when it's running, and then it'll fail and it'll fail and it'll fail and it'll fail. And eventually it'll get a gazelle, and that the calories that it eats have to far outweigh what it used in running. Otherwise, it would not have energy to run again, to reproduce and raise its young, etc. Human systems are the same thing. We need energy for every single thing in our economic system. We need it to mine and deliver and invent and create and manufacture and run and repair and maintain and dispose of every single good in our economy. So we need energy for everything. And to get that energy, we have to spend not money. Of course, money is the marker that allows us to keep social score, but we have to spend energy and minerals and materials to get that energy. So that's called the energy return on energy investment. And back in the 1930s, it would take maybe 1 barrel's worth of energy to discover a field that would have 100 barrels worth of energy. It was a 100-to-1 ratio. And by the 1970s, that had declined to around 30-to-1. And now, depending on the boundaries, it's between 10 and 20-to-1. But the larger story is this. Our society right now is built on our institutions, our governments, our expectations is built on the premise that we only have to spend 5 or 8% of our energy on the energy sector. And the other 92 to 95% of our energy goes to podcasters or Disneyland or universities or hospitals or shopping centers or all that. 1999 marked a 700-year low in the amount of energy that society directed to the energy sector. It was down to around 5%. Now we're at like 10 or 12% of our energy needs to go to the energy sector to find shale oil, to do the horizontal fracturing, to process tar sands, and all that stuff. And it's headed higher. And the implications for that is that as we head to 15% of our society is spent on energy in the energy sector, or maybe 20% of energy, it means that two things. One, our economy becomes more and more of what I refer to as a Mordor economy, which is it's pretty much our objective, our raison d'etre is to mine minerals and energy just to keep the rest of the system going. And secondly, it means that the price of energy will go up and it will price out the NASCAR, the Disneyland, the podcasters. I mean, I bring that up because you and I are podcasters. I don't really mean that specifically, but it means that the marginal users of energy and poor people are going to be priced out because the energy industry needs that energy.
Wow. So is this why then the mad dash for things like nuclear power, like all of a sudden they're talking about tripling nuclear power here in Canada, everywhere around the world, like it just occurred to them that this was going to be a problem. Is this going to solve our problem? Obviously, nuclear fusion's right around the corner. AI is going to invent something and everything's going to be all right, right?
Nuclear is another 90-minute podcast on its own.
Just give us a short and sweet version.
Yeah. Short and sweet version is nuclear, the properties are not liquid fuels. So our current system requires, we're adding 100 million internal combustion cars to the global economy every year. There's over 1 billion cars. Those don't run on nuclear. So our system requires energy dense liquid fuel. Nuclear, like solar and wind, creates electricity and maybe heat. Electricity is only 20% of our global energy use. So nuclear is important, but it's not a silver bullet. And there are also issues with how much uranium there actually is. I've seen estimates of around 60 years or something. So nuclear and renewable energy, all those things could play a role, and they could power a meaningful civilization, just not this civilization, which is 19 terawatts of global just-in-time sort of commerce. So I'm agnostic on nuclear. I think you'll find if you interview people on nuclear, they're fanatics one way or the other. They're like, oh my God, nuclear is going to solve all our problems, or nuclear is horrible. My biggest worry about nuclear is it presumes societal continuity indefinitely. And if there, for whatever reason, not the next 10 years, but maybe the next 50 years or the next 200 years, if there's ever a cessation of global continuity, we have 450 nuclear plants that go critical and spew waste indefinitely. And that's not really factored in the kind of human exceptionalism. We will have civilization for thousands of years indefinitely. So that's something I do worry about as someone who cares about the environment and the non-human sphere.
And is it even practical to create the amount of nuclear power plants that would be required to not even just replace oil, but just to supplement the decline? Would that even be physically possible to do?
There's financial reasons, there are financial limits, there's regulatory limits. All nuclear plants take really long to build, and they're over budget and things like that. I think it could be done. I think technically it could be done, but the amount of energy we would need to replace fossil hydrocarbons is gargantuan. And we would need to be building a nuclear plant every single day for a very long time. And that's just not happening. So I think the more likely future is fossil oil will peak and decline. And even though there's plenty of natural gas, our system requires oil. Mm-hmm. And our financial system, which is something we haven't talked about, is overlaid on top of the energy system. And that's the real kind of Wile E. Coyote aspect of this, is if oil declines 10%, okay, fine. So we only have 90% of our oil that we used to. That's okay. We tighten our belts a little bit. But we have to have higher and higher GDP, because GDP is the income stream needed to service the debts that were created in prior years and decades that we didn't want to tighten our belts in the past. So we kept expanding our financial claims on our biophysical reality. And keep in mind that every dollar, every Canadian dollar that you have in your pocket or in the bank, or even those metal little loonies, is actually a claim on energy. When you spend those loonies or those Canadian bills, whatever you spend it on, all of a sudden required energy to be created. Every single product in Tim Hortons started somewhere in the world with a small fire, or the shopping centers. That's why it's if we decline in oil, it disrupts the whole debt-based financial system that depends on more and more energy. In the future, we're going to probably have to use less energy, not because an authoritarian regime is telling us. It's just there's going to be less energy on the planet. I mean, we've sucked it out with a larger straw. The one thing that unites all the problems that we've mentioned so far is governance. I don't think our governance system can even manage the current situation, let alone the whack-a-mole of all this stuff coming down.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.